Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl Podcast, a 3-time award-winning show that aims to motivate and inspire you while increasing the amount of female role models in the media, especially in relation to adventure and physical challenges. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. If you're passionate about adventure, challenge and learning from women who have overcome obstacles and achieved remarkable things, then this is the podcast for you. Every Tuesday at 7 a.m, new episodes go live featuring incredible women who share their stories, insights and tips to help you achieve your dreams and goals. You can support the Tough Girl mission by signing up as a patron. Visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl Podcast. Keep listening until the very end as I share more information about what's going on with me with Tough Girl Challenges, give shout outs and recommend other Tough Girl Podcast episodes. More information can be found at toughgirlchallenges.com.
My name's Sophie Pierce and I'm a writer and a broadcaster, and I'm based in beautiful Dartmoor in southwest England, a beautiful wild area of the country. We're about sort of 20 miles from the sea and I'm right on the edge of Dartmoor, which is an incredible wild moorland area where I spend a lot of time. I suppose my background is as a journalist, so I worked for the BBC for a long time as a reporter and a producer, but in latter years, mostly as a reporter, sort of out and about, hearing people's stories. And what I do now, I suppose, really grew out of two things. My love of exploring, being outdoors and outdoor swimming, and a terrible tragedy that befell me in 2017 when my son died. I suppose in a way, what I do now has kind of grown out of these particular aspects of my life.
With your love of exploring and swimming and the outdoors, did that start in your childhood? Were you outdoorsy? Was that something that your family inspired of you? Or was this something that you came to later on?
It's definitely a thing that goes back to childhood. I remember I've got 3 brothers and I remember being on holiday, in the West Country and exploring rock pools for hours, swimming with my brothers, sort of basically going quite feral. And we also grew up in the country. So although we lived fairly near London, it was quite rural and we would just go off and in the fields around our houses. And I remember I used to pretend I was a Blue Peter presenter going around the fields and sort of explaining things to my brothers. When we moved to Devon, which was sort of 25 years ago, I had always kept up the swimming, but really it took off again big time because this is just such an incredible part of the world for outdoor swimming. So we've got beautiful rivers on Dartmoor that run over granite, wonderful clear water with waterfalls, cascades, and big pools. Then there's lovely lakes on the moor. And then, of course, there's the coast with its enormous variety of everything from sandy beaches to rocky coves, caves, inlets, estuaries. I really just got very much more into the wild swimming and had a group with friends before Facebook where we would get together and we'd go out like twice a month to explore new places and swim in new places. And I think the reason I've gone back to it in adulthood is it is about something about reclaiming that childhood sense of freedom and wonder, which you get, I think, when you're out exploring in the wild.
Outdoor swimming has definitely, from what I can see on like social media, it seems to just be everywhere. But this is something that you've been doing for 25 years ago. Like, how have things changed? Like, how did you get into it? How did you learn the skills and gain the knowledge that you needed to, to spend time in the water?
I think it's just something that you build up gradually. And I think like all these things, when they become popular, people see opportunities to sell kit and to sell expertise and sell knowledge. But to be honest, I really don't think you need much. It's more about a mindset. It's more about a kind of desire to get out and to be in nature and explore. And to be honest, if you can read a map, you've got a pair of walking boots and swimming costume, that's all you need, really. So I think it's wonderful that there's been this growth. And I think what's particularly lovely about it is all the wonderful communities of swimmers that are building up around our country because people are finding great support and companionship. And there's something about swimming together that connects people in a very profound way. I think it's probably something to do with the fact that when you're in the water, there's this unspoken agreement that you're all looking out for each other, although nobody says that specifically. I think it's also that being together and simply having fun, no matter your age, your size, your social background. Somehow the water seems to connect people.
How regularly are you going wild swimming?
Well, in the summer, it's pretty much every day because I'm very lucky to live near the River Dart, where I can just quickly go and have a swim. In the winter it's less, but I do carry on going through the winter. It's just more difficult because obviously you don't have so many hours in the day of daylight. It gets dark so quickly, and often the conditions are bad. The river might be in spate. We've had so much rain this spring, for example, that I don't think I've swum as much this spring as I have in previous late winter spring times.
One of the things that people talk about, especially with like wild swimming and open water swimming and being in the cold water, is the impact that it can have on your mental health. And I'd love for you just maybe to share how you found that for you. And did you use this to help with the loss of your son?
Definitely. I think it's all very mysterious and there are scientific studies going on about it, but there's something about when you go into natural waters, whether they're cold or warm, really, because sometimes they're warm in the summer, that somehow seems to reset you. It's almost like a baptismal process that you're cleansed, or I don't know, you're somehow in that moment where you're just thinking about that point of where you are in the water, suspended sort of in time and space. And there's something incredibly restorative and healing about that. And when my son died, which was, as I say, back in 2017, so he was only 20 and he died of something called sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And as you can imagine, that was the most devastating shock. He was found dead in his room at college. And at that point, everything in my life completely changed. And it's something that fundamentally, I suppose changed everything for me. And it's not something I think I'll ever get over, but I've kind of learnt to incorporate it in my life and to find new ways of establishing or continuing that bond with him, which is obviously the physical bond of his life has ended. But in the few days after that, I swam every day, and I swam with my friends who I'd swum with for, years before, and we just swam silently in the sea mostly, because it was March and the river was still quite cold and the sea was, I don't know, I found the sea, there's something vast about the sea as well, the way it stretches out almost into eternity, which kind of reflects that feeling of, I suppose, death and despair, but also, I suppose, a feeling of one's place in the world. And these are the kind of big things that you sort of are forced to grapple with when tragedy strikes in your life. And I think that somehow nature, the great outdoors, immersing in these wild landscapes, I've found has been very helpful, because I think it's, in some ways, it kind of helps to put things in perspective. Not that there really is any perspective when something like that happens, but the vast beauty of the world, the beauty of nature, almost the neutrality of nature as well, is something that is helpful, that I've found helpful.
You mentioned that he died of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. What is that?
Well, nobody really knows. So it kind of says what it does what it says on the tin, if you see what I mean. It's a syndrome, I suppose, because that SUDEP describes what happens, but the scientists don't know why. So I later learned after he died that it adversely affects young men. And it basically happens when somebody has epilepsy and it's not necessarily controlled. So with Felix, we tried various medications, but they don't always work. And he was still having seizures. Having seizures is the biggest risk. So if your seizures are well controlled, you're less likely, if you're not having them, you're less likely to die from SUDEP. But basically, what normally happens is the person will die. Often they're found in their rooms. They die overnight, and they think it may be something to do with the breathing or the heart, but they don't know why. They've got something called, there's a charity called SUDEP Action, which is compiling something called the SUDEP Death Register. So every time somebody dies, they ask the bereaved people to provide as much information about that person and their life and the circumstances of their death as possible. So hopefully in the end, there'll be a big enough, database of information for them perhaps to draw some conclusions. But basically it was just a pointless sort of death, really. No answers as to why.
I feel emotional.
It's strange because it's sort of, I have grown used to talking about it because I feel I want to sort of spread awareness. But I suppose I've realized that grief is actually a huge part of life, and grief is actually, in a strange way, a beautiful thing because it connects us all, and it's all about love for the people in our lives. So, and I think grief is something we all go through every day. We have losses great and small all the time. And I suppose with my books, particularly The Green Hill, which is quite a different book from my Wild Swimming Guides, which are much more functional, informational kind of books. The Green Hill is basically, it's a story really of how I coped it's the 4 years after Felix died. And it's really kind of, I suppose, a meditation on loss and grief and the role of the natural world. So most of the book is basically me going for walks and swims in the aftermath of his death and reflecting on how they played into my grief and my loss and how they helped me reconnect. Because I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier in the conversation, for me, Felix is dead, but my relationship and my love is not. So for me, walking and swimming in wild places is very much about reconnecting with him, even on a molecular level. So he's buried in a beautiful graveyard, which is on the banks of the River Dart. So you look down from the graveyard to the River Dart, snaking down to the sea below. And the Green Hill is sort of what we call his burial place, which actually refers back to that hymn, There is a Green Hill Far Away Without a City Wall, which basically refers to the sacrifice of a young man, Jesus Christ, and is a sort of poetic remembrance from my childhood, I suppose. But going back to that point about the sort of molecular connection, I kind of feel that, his body's in the ground, his sort of atoms are kind of spreading out into the ground, into the river, into the sea, and it all kind of connects back in one big natural universe. And I suppose that's what's sort of in the back of my mind when I'm out in nature.
And on your website, you've got photos of Felix, especially when he was, younger as a child, and you can see him out in nature. You by a trig point and with a map and having those, quality moments. And what's one of those magical memories that you look back on with just, I suppose with fondness and with love?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning, in a way, it was quite hard to go back to the places where we'd spent lots of time because it was just too painful. And actually, I was quite keen to explore new places and create new memories, if you know what I mean. So quite early on in the book, in The Green Hill, I talk about going on this walk to part of the coast path that we'd never been to before. And I found this beautiful lagoon in the rocks, and I sort of swam in it, and I have this little ceremony that I do where I find a boulder and I drop it to the bottom of the water. And I kind of did this sort of as a kind of small kind of little ritual to remember Felix. And then I christened it Felix Lagoon. And that has become a place that I go back to. That's from a time of very early grief. And then as time passed, I was able to go back more to the places where we had a lot of memories. So, for example, along the River Dart, walking along to a beautiful place called Bellpool, where we spent a lot of time with the boys because there was a beautiful pool with a lovely rocky ledge that you could leap off into the water on. And I remember, I think the actual memories are still quite painful, but I remember a time after he died walking along that very same path and remembering him as a child pretending to be a train going along the path and making sort of puffing noises. And that was a lovely, lovely memory. And I think memories are something I talk about a lot in the book, and about how memory is something that you think you can rely on, but often when you're in the depths of grief, you just can't dredge up those memories, which is, I think, all part of the trauma, but they do come back, which I'm very glad to report.
After the loss of your son, did you get help and support with helping you to process your trauma? You know, was there somebody that you could speak to? Did you want to speak to somebody? Like, how did you really sort of process? Obviously, you know, spending time in nature, very, very important. But were there other things that you were doing as well, sort of alongside that?
I did have some counselling from the charity Pseudo Action over the phone, which, if I'm honest, I didn't really find that helpful. And I also tried having therapy. And I think it probably would have helped other people, but I think it's a very personal thing. And I just don't think that kind of talking therapy is for me. I mean, interestingly, I went to a very interesting book talk recently by a woman called Ruth Allen, who's written a book called Weathering, which is all about rocks and the landscape and psychology and psychotherapy. And she works outside with people. So she goes to moorland around Sheffield in the Peak District, and people sort of interact with rocks. And I think that would have been much more helpful for me if I'd known that was available. Something about, for me, you know, given my background, what I've told you about me, sitting in a little room with somebody I don't really know, it's just not me. But being outside and incorporating the landscape into my thoughts and processes and emotions, that for me was the biggest therapy and the biggest help of all.
After writing your book, did you, and the word I'm going to use isn't the right word, did you get a sense of not closure, but and not even acceptance, but like, did it help to move the grief along?
Well, it was helpful, but it wasn't a case of moving the grief along, because I suppose what I've realized is that there's this whole narrative about grief, which is kind of imposed by society, which is all about going on a journey and somehow getting to a destination and having closure. Whereas actually for me, it's not about closure. It's about openings, and it's about continuing the relationship. And I think, you know, grief is a very personal thing. I mean, perhaps for some people, they want to feel that they've processed it and can move on. But for me, it's like, well, why would I want to sort of tie it up neatly and put it in a box and put it away and okay, right, let's carry on. I don't feel that at all. Having said all that, writing the book was amazingly therapeutic for me, because I felt I was making a memorial to Felix, and I felt that I was creating something beautiful out of something terrible. And that is amazing. But funnily enough, when I finished the book and when it came out, that was quite hard, because I felt almost a sense of loss, that this part of of my grieving was kind of ended, because it had been such a wonderful focus for me to work on the book. And I mean, I never intended to write the book. Obviously, it grew out of basically letters that I wrote to Felix, and which became like a diary. And basically, it kept me going, having that to focus on in those early years of grief. So in a funny kind of way, there was a bit of grief when the book came out, because it was like, oh, right, okay, I need to continue this process, but I need to find another way to do it.
How was it with friends and with family? Because you're dealing with something which is so personal, and actually it can be like, I'm even struggling to find the right words. But for people who are close to you, like in terms of like offering support with the loss of a loved one, what did you find helped you?
I think people who just showed up really and just, said, we're there for you. And with my close family and friends, everybody was amazing. And I think where people find it difficult is, frankly, we're all terrified of death, aren't we? And people want to try and fix it. So they sort of say things like, sometimes, somebody did say, everything happens for a reason to me, which she regretted it as soon as she'd said it, and she felt terrible. But it just came out of wanting to try and help, which is so kind and so understandable. But, people think they can try and help and fix it. And the other thing people think is that they could say something to make it worse, but they don't really have the power to do that. Nothing can make it worse. I mean, really, it's basically just saying, I'm here. What do you need? And not trying to make it better. Not trying to because when people try to sort of reassure you, make it better, they kind of diminish the loss, which I think is the problem with that. So, but I mean, it was very hard having to see people that I didn't know very well for the first time. Like I remember clearly, I live in a small town, and having to walk into town for the first time and knowing that people knew and having to sort of face them and deal with their reaction. And it's hard for everybody, but it was something I had to do to sort of break the ice. And, you become an object of interest, which is kind of quite difficult. And I think the other thing is that, kind of relating to what we said before about, there isn't really any sense of sort of the process coming to an end. And I think going on from there, as sort of, a year or two passes, people sort of, obviously they forget about it and they move on from it. But obviously I didn't, and I haven't. And it's something I talk about in the book quite a lot, actually. It's a sense of having a double life. So, on the surface, I'm normal, I'm me, I'm doing what I do, gone back to work, but there's another person inside that's deeply wounded and in trauma, really. And that's really, really kind of disorientating, that sense of being two people at once, which has got less now because it's what is it, 7 years since he died. So that sense has definitely lessened, and I feel like I'm more back to myself, incorporating him within me rather than this awful chasm of sort of trauma dragging me down every day. I suppose for me, it's like, when you have a very heavy rucksack to start with. And if you wear that rucksack every day, you get used to dealing with that weight and you get much stronger, and you can carry it everywhere with you. And it's a bit like that, I think, carrying grief with you.
I've also heard that the second year can be tougher than the first year, because the first year is always, it's the first Christmas without them, the first birthday, the first Mother's Day, etc. So you're going through all these sort of firsts for the first time, and people are aware of that and probably still remember and will be reaching out and checking in. But in the second year, like you said, it's almost then maybe you're a bit more alone because people have forgotten, not through being malicious, just through moving on. How was the second year of loss for you?
Well, I think exactly as you said. I mean, it was just as hard, if not worse. In fact, I bumped into somebody, a fellow bereaved mother, the other day in the street who, she lost her son to suicide, and a year or two after Felix. And I bumped into her in the street, and it's both a few years on for us now. And she told me, that I'd said to her when I bumped into her, oh, the second year is is much worse, which I completely forgot about and probably wasn't very helpful. But, Yeah, I mean, it was really because, the story's over as far as everyone else is concerned, but, it's very much not over as far as we were concerned. And I think it's in the first year of bereavement, I mean, in the book, I kind of talk about it, and this might sound really weird, but I talk about it as almost like being in love. It was like this intensity of emotion, but obviously grief. And it's like you're just swinging each way from pillar to post. You're just getting by. You're surviving, you're just surviving. And in the second year, it's like, right, okay, this is it. This is it for the rest of my life. It's just like, this really has happened. And, it's bloody tough. But saying that, it has got better now. It has got better. So yeah, I agree. The second year is worse.
You mentioned, sort of like throwing yourself back into work, and with work, it's very closely connected to writing and also to wild swimming, because you've been the author of sort of several wild swimming guides. And how was that? And, sharing your love of wild swimming, because you've got sort of 5 books, you've four, well, actually, no, 5 published now. Would you like to share more about the books and what you're doing with them?
Yeah. No, I mean, I just love writing and researching these books because it's just doing what I love, and that's how they came about. So I write them with my friend Matt, who I've known for about 20 years. And it's really funny because everyone thinks we're married, but we're not. Well, we are, but to different men, if you know what I mean. But we're great sort of partners in crime, and we just fell into it, really. So when I met Matt, I was working for the BBC, and he was working as a sort of events manager at the tourist board, and I interviewed him about something he was doing. And then we discovered we shared a love of swimming and exploring, and we started just to do that in our spare time. And then we got asked to do a talk about swimming along the coast in Torbay, which is a international UNESCO geopark because of its geology. So a really good way to see the geology is by swimming. So we did a talk, and then somebody said, "Oh, why don't you turn it into a book?" So we did, which we self-published in a very amateur fashion and used the cheapest printer we could find, and the books all fell apart sort of immediately. But actually, it was quite a good book in the end, even though we self-published it, and it brought us to the attention of Daniel Start, who runs a very successful company called Wild Things Publishing, which publishes beautiful outdoor books, adventure books, basically. And he was just starting a new series called Wild Swimming Walks, which was a very clever concept he'd come up with. He'd already written a book about wild swimming in general, and he had this idea of having walks with swims, which is a great idea because obviously it increases the appeal of the book. What could be nicer than going for a walk as well as a swim? Anyway, so we ended up doing the second one in the series, which is Dartmoor in South Devon. And since then, we've done several more. So our latest, Exmoor in North Devon, is out now. Also, we did one about Cornwall, and we did one about Dorset and East Devon, and we did another book about Torbay, about swim routes in Torbay, which was actually a 10-year anniversary new edition of the first book we self-published. And I suppose it's what I love about producing these books is it's a very, very joyful process because we make a virtue of meeting up with local people. We set up a Facebook group for the book, and then we meet lots of lovely people who want to come and do all the research with us, and they become friends. And it's altogether a very life-enhancing and wonderful process. I mean, it's very hard work because the books are very information-heavy. So you have lovely inspiring text, which we write, a lovely piece of inspiring text that you can sort of sit and read by the fire in the winter while you plan your adventures. But then there's also maps, directions, photographs, and detailed information like postcodes, where to go for lunch, how long the walk is, what level of difficulty it is. So as you can imagine, it's a super, super intensive, detailed process putting the books together, but extremely satisfying when they come out. And the other wonderful thing about them is the covers. So they have these beautiful illustrated covers done by quite a famous book illustrator called James Lewis, who does lots of books. He does Professor Alice Roberts's books, for example. And Daniel, the publisher, was great because he got him in early on this and had the idea of an illustrated cover. And since then, they've all been brilliant and they look really great together as a set. And there are now lots of others. So a new one about the Peak District came out this year at the same time as ours. There's one for Snowdonia. There's one for the Brecon Beacons, I believe. So yeah, it's a really lovely thing to be part of.
Do you ever get pushback from locals who are like, I don't want you sharing our beautiful spots
Yes.
with the world. I want to gatekeep this and not, and it's not going to be beautiful anymore by publishing these places. How do you balance that out?
Well, it's interesting actually, because this does come up and, we sometimes agree. So, for example, there is a gorgeous little tidal pool in Cornwall, which I really wanted to put in, but the locals asked me not to, or asked us not to, I should say. And on that occasion, we decided not to. There was another one in Cornwall, which is called Baker's Pit, which is a place where people have swum for years, which is an old, clay pit, but it's a nature reserve now. And even though, it has been habitually a place that people have swum, local people have swum, when we got there were lots of no swimming signs from the Wildlife Trust. And again, we decided to take that out. We're always very sympathetic to people who have good reasons for not wanting a place to be in there. But at the same time, we sometimes get this at talks as well when we do. I remember we did a talk once and somebody said, how can you sleep at night? You've told people all about these special places. And my response was, well, when you go to the Lake District or somewhere you don't know, do you think there shouldn't be a guidebook then? Presumably when you go somewhere, you want to know where the places are to go. So are you saying that we shouldn't be allowed to publish information about places? Because that's the sort of logical end of that argument, which I don't think anyone would agree with. So it's basically a balance, a balancing act all the time. And, obviously with our books as well, it's about going for a walk. So essentially, a lot of people, they'll drive up in their cars to wherever the honeypot spot is, get out, have a swim, get back in, go home. Whereas what we do is, because we walk, you're going to spread people out. You're not going to get hordes of people going to places where you've got to walk 4 miles or 8 miles to get to the swim spot. So I think that's kind of how we sort of deal with that. But obviously there are often valid reasons for not including places like, if there's a lot of erosion, for example, on a riverbank, we wouldn't include that. It's just a constant process of deciding what you put in, what you leave out.
One of the things that I seem to be reading about recently is just, especially in the UK, with maybe certain rules and regulations being relaxed with regards to sewage, is that actually some of these most beautiful places are actually being destroyed by sewage. And what can people do not to stop that, but to stop that, to make an impact? Have you come across things like that? Have you noticed that change throughout your years of being a wild swimmer?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think there's a lot of publicity about it now, but it hasn't always gone on. It's just that we haven't known about it. And I think there's I hesitate to use the word hysteria about it. It's a question that we've been asked a lot recently because we've been out on tour with the new book and people are very frightened. And I think it's right to be concerned. And I think it is an absolute scandal, the amount of sewage that is going into the sea, particularly. I think obviously there's things you can do. So there's a brilliant Surfers Against Sewage app. So you can always check that. It's not so good with rivers. So I would say if you're worried, you need to check the app if you're going to the sea. And if you decide to swim when there's sewage coming into the sea, then obviously don't put your face in. And with rivers, with me, I very much do a risk assessment of my own. I look at it and I decide whether I want to go in and whether I'm going to put my head in. And I think all these things, it's very much, everybody has different attitudes to risk, don't they, as well? So one person might not be worried, whereas another might be really, really concerned. But I think the other thing is that people can, you can write to your MP and campaign as well about it. But I do think that there's a lot of fear out there, but I think it has always happened. We just haven't known about it. So I think with all these things, try and keep it in perspective and use your common sense when approaching a body of water. And if it looks and smells awful, I wouldn't go in.
Sophie, where are you most active on social media? Where can people find more information out about you?
I'm on Instagram and X. So Instagram is Ms. Sophie Pierce, MS. Sophie Pierce, SophiePierce. And on X, I'm at Sophie Pierce. And I've got a website, obviously sophiepierce.co.uk.
Perfect. I'll add all of those links into the show notes so that people can connect, follow along and buy your books. But I'd love for you to have the final words of advice. And there's almost, I suppose, two areas. You can combine it into one piece of advice or two separate pieces of advice. The first one is, I suppose, advice for women who are dealing with grief through the loss of their child. What advice would you have for them? And the second one, what advice would you have for women who want to go wild swimming, but please don't say just do it?
I mean, I think the loss of a child is totally devastating, and I would really hesitate to give any advice to anybody about how to deal with it, because it is such a profound earthquake in your life, and it's so personal and so huge that I really don't feel I can offer any advice other than to share my story, which is what I've done with the Green Hill. And I think to know you're not alone is really helpful. And all I would say is that, you're not alone, and that many of us have sadly gone through this. And I think you have to find your own way through. And that's what survival is all about. And for me, it's been about being in the wild, being in the sea, being in rivers, being in mountains, being on the moorland, and finding some kind of solace there. And I think the wild swimming is all connected to that. So it's about us feeling a sense of adventure and maybe bravery. It's leaping into that dimension where you have no weight, you're supported by the water, you feel very much immersed in nature and part of a wild beauty, really. And for me, that is the joy of wild swimming. It's a very metaphysical experience where the boundaries between mind and body kind of blur. And that's why I would sort of heartily recommend it. And I think if it's something you want to try, there's lots of ways of connecting with people. So there's lots of groups on Facebook. There's lots of wonderful groups. There's like mental health swims where they're totally open and inclusive, and you can just look them up on their website and find a group near you and go and join, because it will be life enhancing.
Sophie, thank you so much for coming on Tough Girl Podcast and sharing more about your story, your grief, your loss, but also your love and passion for swimming, spending time in the outdoors. I really appreciate everything that you've shared, and I'm sure our listeners will as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hey Tribe, I really hope you enjoyed the episode with Sophie. Everything that we have talked about today will be available in the show notes at toughgirlchallenges.com. So please do go and check out the website. New episodes of the Tough Girl podcast go live every Tuesday at 7 a.m. UK time. On the 23rd of July, we are going to be speaking with Alex Larson. She's a dietitian and triathlete who is fueling endurance athletes for peak performance and personal success. I'm just going to share a little bit more about that episode. Alex Larson, registered dietitian from Minnesota, whose passion for nutrition was ignited when she crossed the finish line of Ironman Wisconsin. Alex is dedicated to helping endurance athletes achieve peak performance through optimal nutrition. Alex balances her thriving career with family life, being married with 3 young children aged between 7 years and 8 months. With over 20 triathlons, including multiple Ironmans and numerous 10Ks and half marathons under her belt, she brings a wealth of personal experience to her practice. In the episode, Alex shares her journey from being a competitive teenager with a passion for horseback riding to a seasoned triathlete and dedicated dietitian. After an injury in college, she discovered swimming and eventually fell in love with triathlons. Alex offers personalised nutrition strategies that help athletes fall back in love with their sport and life. She discusses her flexible eating approach, practical nutrition tips, and the importance of individualised plans. From dealing with pre-race nerves to managing gut issues, Alex provides valuable insights for athletes at all levels. So if you are interested in listening to that episode, make sure you do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. If you hit the subscribe button, it means that the episodes will automatically down straight to your phone or your listening device so that you'll always have something to listen to. And hopefully you'll always be listening to the Tough Girl podcast. There are now over 700 episodes for you to choose from. So please do take a moment, if you haven't done so already, to visit toughgirlchallenges.com, which is basically the main central hub, the main website. There's more information about me, the different adventures and challenges that I've done, from through hiking the Tiara Trail in New Zealand, walking the Wales Coast Path, doing Scottish hikes, spending time over in America, cycling down the Pacific Coast Highway. I've also through hiked the Appalachian Trail. A lot of these adventures and challenges are also shared through my YouTube channel. There are vlogs, there are short films, etc., which you'll probably enjoy watching. There is also a resources section on the blog, and in the resources section you can find more information about the top 10 Tough Girl podcast episodes. That's for each year and overall. Then there's also more specific information. So if your passion is ultra running or through hiking or ultra endurance challenges, there are dedicated sections to each of those challenges. You click into them and then there'll be more information for you to find out. So for example, with triathletes, if you visit the website, you can listen to Louise Mitchin, there's Dr. Katie Mint, there's Paula Craig, MBE, there's Regina Kenny, there's Jennifer Price. She was an army officer and she went to being an army officer doing extreme endurance challenges, 12 challenges in 12 months, including an Ironman, a multi-stage desert ultramarathon, climbing Mount Aconcagua and doing a 1,000-mile self-supported Land's End to John O'Groats cycle ride. We've spoken to Fenella Langridge. She's a professional triathlete with over 70.3 distance. Melissa Yuri, the first woman to complete Uberman, an ultra triathlon, a 21-mile swim, a 400-mile bike ride, followed by a 135-mile run through Death Valley. And we've also spoken with Chrissy Wellington, British triathlete and 4-time world Ironman champion, wife, mum, and global head of health and wellbeing at Parkrun. I keep scrolling down. There's so many incredible women who've been on Tough Girl podcast to share more of the story. It's bringing back memories for me as well, actually, looking back on it. I mean, the podcast has been going since 2015. There's over 700 episodes. That's a lot of women sharing their stories, providing advice and top tips to help you after your dreams and ambitions. One of the things that I find work really well is having a goal to work towards, having something in the diary that you can train towards. So if you haven't already, get on Google, get searching, find your next Ironman, find your next 5K, find your next 10K, find your next challenge or adventure, get it booked in and get it in the diary, get committed to it and start training for it. Continue listening to Tough Girl podcast to make sure that you are constantly filling your head with inspiration and motivation, as well as all of those top tips and advice. Thank you so much for listening. All that's left for me to say is, wherever you are, whatever you are doing, give it your all, give it 110%, get after it, go for it, believe in yourself, because I believe in you. Take care, lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.